July 1943, the humid dawn over New Guinea vibrates with engine thunder. A lone P-40 Warhawk cuts through the pale gold light, its Allison engine pushing the fighter toward a climbing arc above the Owen Stanley Peaks. Inside the cockpit, the American pilot wipes a streak of sweat from his goggles as the radio crackles, with terse warnings. Japanese fighters A6M0s are rising fast from the north. He levels out at 14,000 feet. The sky is suddenly full of movement. 3 silver shapes dive in a tight spiral, sunlight flashing off their wings. Tracers whip past his canopy. He banks hard, feels the airframe groan, and watches a Zero overshoot. For a split second, its silhouette floats perfectly inside his gun sight, exactly at the range he had set his guns for, the range everyone had mocked. He presses the trigger. 6.50 caliber Brownings erupt in a single, devastating cone. The first Zero disintegrates. The second crosses his sightline moments later, then vanishes in an explosion of fuel and metal. The third tries to climb away, but the concentrated pattern catches it at the wing root. 3 kills, barely 2 minutes, all made possible by the crazy modification no one had taken seriously. And it all began months earlier, on a sweltering airstrip where few believed it would matter. The air war over New Guinea in 1943 was unlike any other front in the Second World War. It was a battlefield suspended between mountains, monsoon clouds, and dense jungle land environment so harsh that pilots often said the weather claimed more aircraft than enemy guns ever did. For the men of the U.S. 5th Air Force, every mission began with engines coughing to life on crude, muddy airstrips carved out coconut groves or kunai grass fields. Their opponents, the seasoned pilots of Japan's 6th and 4th Air Groups, launched from better developed bases. Flying aircraft famed for agility and climb, the Mitsubishi A6M0. The Zero's strengths were well known. Its turning ability could catch even experienced American pilots off guard. It climbed faster, maneuvered tighter, and at lower speeds behaved with a harmony no U.S. fighter fully matched. In the early years of the Pacific War, but the Americans had their own advantages that were increasing with each month of combat. Their aircraft, like the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk and the emerging Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, were tougher, faster in a dive, and most importantly, carried a brutal weight of firepower. 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, far deadlier than the Japanese 7.7mm and 20mm mixed armament. Yet even with superior firepower, one problem plagued many pilots: factory-set gun convergence. Federal manufacturing standards aligned a fighter's guns so their bullet streams crossed at a predetermined distance, often around 300 yards. In perfect conditions, this was an acceptable compromise. But New Guinea offered nothing close to perfect conditions. The dense cloud layers, sudden monsoon bursts, towering mountains, and chaotic dogfights pushed combat ranges much closer, sometimes under 150 yards. Pilots who fired from too far often watched their tracers harmlessly scatter around an enemy aircraft instead of tearing through it. This led to a quiet but significant trend among American flyers, modifying the gun harmonization distance on their own aircraft. By tightening the convergence from 300 yards down to 250, 200, or even 150 yards, pilots could create a devastatingly concentrated stream of fire. It demanded nerve because it meant getting dangerously close. But in New Guinea's chaotic turning fights, being close was inevitable anyway. These modifications weren't always welcomed. Some ground crews believed it tampered with factory precision. Some squadron leaders disliked the risks of encouraging close-range attacks. And fellow pilots often joked that such changes were reckless, show-off ideas, or in some cases, crazy. The 5th Air Force valued discipline, and anything that deviated from the manual attracted skepticism. But the American culture of improvisation, the willingness to adapt under fire, was impossible to suppress. At forward bases like Port Moresby, Dobadura, Sealy, and Gooseup, the heat-warped metal, dust-clogged engines, and aircraft needed constant care. Every day brought challenges that original designers had never imagined. When something wasn't working, the men fixed it with whatever they had: modified fuel pumps, rewired radios, reinforced wings, and among the boldest, ray-harmonized guns. The pilot at the heart of this story, anonymous for historical accuracy, yet representing several real men whose combat reports matched these events, was one of those who refused to accept factory settings as divine law. After studying gun camera footage, he concluded that most missed bursts came from firing too early and at the wrong range. He believed that if he could bring every bullet into a deadly cluster at the precise moment the enemy filled his sight, the results would be catastrophic for the enemy. He proposed a new convergence distance. Shorter, riskier, sharper. Armorers frowned. Fellow pilots laughed. Someone reportedly called it a good way to waste ammo before you die, but he insisted. He walked the ground crew through the adjustment, helped realign the gun mounts, and calibrated the sight markings himself. Still, dismissive remarks followed him for weeks. Some doubted his math, others doubted his nerve, a few doubted his sanity, but to him, it was simple. If he could make 6 guns strike as one fist instead of 6 scattered fingers, he would win fights faster than the enemy could react. The problem was proving it, and proving it meant surviving long enough to show results. And the proving ground would emerge soon enough, shaped by the weather, the terrain, and the growing pressure on American pilots confronting a skilled, determined opponent in the skies above New Guinea. It was into this world of doubt, innovation, and daily danger that the mission of July 1943 began to take shape. Life on a forward airstrip in New Guinea was a study in contradictions. By day, the heat was suffocating, metal tools burned hands, fuel evaporated too quickly, and engines overheated before they even reached the runway. By night, the air cooled just enough for clouds of insects to descend, carried by the damp jungle air. Rain turned the runways into sticky pools of mud, and the same monsoon that grounded aircraft also fed the mosquitoes that spread malaria through entire squadrons. Yet every morning, long before the first zero appeared on the horizon, ground crews and pilots were already at work. The pilot, whose modification would soon shock his entire squadron, followed a routine shared by many in the 5th Air Force. He rose at sunrise, pulled on sweat-soaked boots, and walked past rows of revetments made from coconut logs and sandbags. The men lived close to their machines. Tents were pitched beside aircraft bays, and the smell of gun oil mixed constantly with breakfast rations. Everything was improvised. Showers built from fuel drums, chairs made from crates, workbenches hammered together from salvaged plywood. In this improvised world, the idea of modifying a fighter's guns wasn't radical. It was simply another act of frontline adaptation, but that didn't mean others welcomed it. Pilots were a proud group, and many believed skill, not equipment, decided survival. Changing factory specifications felt to some like challenging the expertise of designers and armorers who had studied ballistics for years. Others feared that narrowing the convergence would create overconfidence, that the pilot would be forced into dangerously close ranges where a single mistake could be fatal. And then there were the traditionalists, men who held firmly to the belief, if it isn't standard, it isn't safe. So when word spread across the squadron that he had asked the armorers to readjust all 6 .50 caliber Brownings to converge at 200 yards instead of 300, the reactions were immediate. A few laughed. One pilot reportedly joked that he was turning the Warhawk into a shotgun. Another suggested that such a tight cluster would be useless unless the enemy politely held still. But beneath the humor was something sharper, skepticism born from fear. In New Guinea's brutal air war, each man respected that a misjudgment in combat could be fatal. Few believed a single adjustment could change that. Yet the pilot persisted. He spent evenings studying gun camera footage, both his own and those captured by fellow flyers. He saw tracers crossing to early, patterns spreading to wide, and bursts missing entirely when the Zero's outline sat just beyond the factor's set range. He believed the Americans had a hidden advantage their training didn't fully exploit. Superior firepower concentrated into a single, overwhelming point. To unlock it, he needed the guns to work with the chaotic reality of the Pacific, not the standardized expectations of a stateside firing range. On the ground, the modification was simple. In the air, proving it would be anything but. The pilot flew several missions after the adjustment, though opportunities to test it were limited. Many sorties were patrols without contact, long hours spent gazing over endless jungle canopy broken only by the faint glint of the sea. Others ended quickly in cloud formation so thick that entire flights disappeared from view. The Japanese, aware of American air presence, chose their engagements carefully. Dogfights over New Guinea began suddenly and ended quickly, with both sides using terrain and clouds to escape, but the tension grew each day. The Japanese were increasing aerial pressure to support ground operations. American supply lines were stabilizing, giving pilots more fuel and ammunition, and command expected an escalation of air combat along the northern approaches. Within the squadron, the pilot sensed a shift. While the jokes continued, Some men quietly asked him to explain the math. Others wanted to know how he planned to approach targets with such a short convergence. Even a few armorers admitted they were curious after all. They also studied the impact patterns on the makeshift gunnery boards placed behind the revetments. Still, the skepticism remained. Pilots were killed weekly. Confidence was fragile. Tradition held tight. What none of them realized was how quickly all of those doubts would be stripped away, because the next mission was forced by weather, timing, and the Japanese pushing farther than expected would give him a chance not just to test his idea, but to demonstrate it in a way no one would forget. And when it came, it began not with combat, but with a simple briefing on another humid morning, as the squadron prepared for what seemed like an ordinary patrol dot in aerial gunnery. Every fraction of a second matters, every degree of deflection, every yard of distance. For U.S. fighters like the P-40 and P-47, the placement of 6 wing-mounted, 50 caliber Browning machine guns created a wide, brutal spread of fire. But the effectiveness of that fire depended entirely on one detail: where the streams of bullets crossed. At factory settings, convergence was typically around 300 yards of distance, based more on standardized testing than the chaotic reality of Pacific dogfighting against the Zero. This distance created a problem. Japanese pilots forced engagements into tight, swirling turns. Most firing opportunities occurred at 100 to 200 yards, far inside the factory pattern. When American pilots squeezed the trigger too early, their bullets crossed in front of the target and separated again, causing bursts to streak harmlessly round the Zero's wings. A tighter convergence 200 or 150 yards changed the equation completely. Instead of 6 separated streams, it produced one devastating cone, where every round hammered nearly the same point. It meant that a single 1-second burst could disintegrate a fighter's wing or cockpit. But it demanded nerve. To use it effectively, a pilot had to get close enough that he could smell burning fuel and feel his canopy shake from his own muzzle blast. It required discipline, patience, and precision traits not every young flyer possessed. Yet those who mastered it gained a lethal edge. This was the tactical philosophy behind the pilot's modification. To most, it seemed dangerous. To him, it was merely adjusting his tools to reality, and the reality was simple. The closer he fired, the more unstoppable his Warhawk became. This tactical truth would form the backbone of the mission that soon approached. Frontline innovation became a trademark of U.S. aviators in the Southwest Pacific. The 5th Air Force lived and fought in conditions no manual prepared them for. Mosquito nets doubled as map covers. Rain ponchos became engine guards. Spare parts were carved from salvaged wrecks. In this culture, resourcefulness wasn't eccentricate with survival. The pilot embodied this spirit. He viewed every piece of equipment not as a fixed object, but as a tool that could be refined. While others debated risk, he quietly searched for solutions. His notebooks carried sketches of convergence patterns, calculations of bullet dispersion, and notes comparing his gun camera frames to the attack doctrines taught in stateside training. He wasn't defiant. He wasn't reckless. He simply refused to accept limitations imposed by factory defaults. American frontline life encouraged this mindset. Living beside their aircraft, pilots and mechanics formed deep trust. They repaired battle damage under lantern light, swapped parts to keep one more plane in the air, and made decisions based on instinct sharpened by daily danger. When a pilot suggested modifying his guns, it wasn't rebellion, it was another attempt to survive the next fight. And this approach often paid off. Improvised drop tanks, field-adjusted turbochargers, modified oxygen masks, even handcrafted gun sights. American airmen pioneered countless fixes that later became accepted standards. His convergence change was simply the next innovation in a long chain of field-tested improvements. But humans are slow to accept what challenges their habits. Courage is easiest to admire in hindsight, and so he worked quietly, letting his results in time speak for him. Those results were now approaching, carried on rising tension within the squadron and increasing Japanese pressure in the skies. Japanese fighter pilots entered the Pacific War confident in their aircraft and training. Early victories had reinforced their belief that the Zero's agility guaranteed superiority, especially in close-quarters combat. They understood American firepower, but in their early encounters, U.S. fire often lacked precision. Bursts passed wide, bullets scattered. Kills required multiple attacks. But by mid-1943, Japanese reports began noting something troubling. American fire was becoming far deadlier. Gun camera frames recovered from crashed U.S. fighters showed tighter impact groups. Damage on down zero suggested they were being hit with more concentrated bursts. Pilots who survived bailouts described sudden, overwhelming strikes that tore through their aircraft before they had time to react to them. It felt as though American fighters had sharpened their claws. They couldn't yet pinpoint why. Some attributed it to better pilot training, others to new ammunition belts. A few believed Americans were simply becoming more aggressive. What they did not realize, what they could not have known, was that pilots like the one in this story were quietly reshaping the lethality of U.S. fighters one adjustment at a time. And when these modified guns opened fire in combat, Japanese aviators felt the difference immediately. Soon, 3 of them would encounter this Titan convergence firsthand within minutes of each other leaving their comrades, stunned at how quickly a single American fighter had shattered their formation. And that moment, still ahead in this story, would forever change how his squadron viewed him. The .50 caliber Browning M2 was the backbone of American air power, reliable, durable, and brutally powerful. Each gun fired over 750 rounds per minute, launching armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer ammunition in carefully arranged belts. But raw firepower meant little without accuracy, and in wing-mounted configurations like the P-40 and P-47, alignment was everything. Each gun sat several feet from the next, angled inward so their bullet streams would intersect at one precise distance. A change of even a few degrees altered where the rounds met and where they didn't. Adjusting convergence wasn't guesswork. It required a methodical process, removing the wing access panels, reeling each gun mount by fractions of a degree, freeing test burst into a gunnery board behind the revetments, measuring dispersion patterns, with chalk markers repeating the process until all 6 bursts intersected. Clean-light pilot worked alongside armorers through this process, making sure every gun fired into a tight focal point at exactly 200 yards. When tested on the board, the pattern was remarkable: 6 scorching clusters almost overlapping. Armorers admitted privately that they had rarely seen such density. But technology alone didn't guarantee results. The modification demanded precision flying. A too early shot would be useless. A too late shot could be fatal. Still, once calibrated, the Warhawk became a different machine. Its firepower wasn't merely increased, it was focused, creating a weapon capable of destroying a fighter with a single, well-timed burst. Technically, nothing about the change violated regulations. It was simply a more refined use of the tools already available. But few understood the significance yet. Commanders in the 5th Air Force faced constant pressure. They battled fuel shortages, weather delays, malaria outbreaks, and the challenge of fighting a skilled enemy on unfamiliar terrain. Their mission was clear: maintain air superiority long enough to support ground operations, and interdict Japanese supply routes. In this environment, leaders had to balance discipline with flexibility. Innovation was encouraged, but only when it didn't jeopardize safety or cohesion. Convergence modifications lived in a gray area. They weren't prohibited, but neither were they widely endorsed. Squadron leaders often preferred consistency. Standardized settings meant predictable performance and simplified training. The pilot's insistence on changing those settings forced leadership into a quiet dilemma. Was he undermining discipline or improving capability? Should they forbid the adjustment or let the results decide? Ultimately, it was the latter. Commanders allowed the modification to stand, partly because the pilot articulated his reasoning clearly, and partly because the 5th Air Force had already seen how frontline improvisation could yield breakthroughs. Radar placement, field fuel systems, and even early forms of skip bombing had all emerged from men willing to challenge norms. Still, they watched him closely. If his modification failed, especially in combat, it would reinforce skepticism and tighten leadership's grip on procedural standards. If it succeeded, it could open the door for broader tactical shifts. Leadership didn't oppose innovation, they simply couldn't endorse it until it proved itself. And that proof, for better or worse, was coming with the next engagement. Flying from a New Guinea airstrip placed constant strain on the mind. Pilots lived with the knowledge that each mission could be their last. They heard the engines of comrades who never returned. They saw empty bunks after nights of combat. In that environment, any deviation from routine, any new idea invited scrutiny. The pilot felt this scrutiny daily. He heard jokes made just loud enough to reach him. He felt the glances during briefings. He sensed the underlying message: if you fail, we were right. Such tension was common in squadrons. Rivalry sharpened performance, but it also fed insecurity. Everyone wanted to prove themselves. Everyone feared being the next casualty. The idea of a crazy modification touched that fear directly. If it worked, it meant others were missing an advantage. If it failed, it reinforced distrust of innovation, yet psychological pressure fueled determination. The pilot trained harder, studied longer, and refined his firing discipline until it became instinct. Quietly, he resolved that if combat presented an opening, he would seize it with absolute precision. His peers didn't dislike him, if anything. They were waiting to see if he would succeed. Every squadron had men who tried new ideas. Some became legends, others became cautionary tales. Until the moment of proof arrived, no one knew which path he would take. That moment was now drawing near. The next mission briefing would send him into the sky where doubt, rivalry, technology, and innovation would collide in a single test one. That would change not only his standing in the squadron, but the lethality of American fighters across the region. The test in the sky, the mission that changed everything, mission began like countless. Others quiet tension, muffled footsteps on packed red clay, and the sharp scent of aviation fuel mixing with morning mist. But inside the pilot's chest, this story carried a weight unlike any before. He wasn't just flying a patrol. He was testing a theory in the most unforgiving laboratory on Earth. Dawn had barely broken when the squadron assembled at the briefing hut. The operations officer pointed at the map on the wall. Japanese fighters were probing supply routes. Near Buna again, a fast intercept was needed. No bomber escort, no ground attack, just a sweep to push Zeros away from Allied positions. As pilots scribbled the grid coordinates into their knee boards, the pilot noticed the glances. Not hostile, curious, cautious, waiting. They all knew he had altered his convergence. This mission would show whether his idea was genius or recklessness. Engines thundered to life across the strip. Dust blasted outward from spinning propellers. The Warhawk felt alive under his hand, solid, dependable, eager. Takeoff was uneventful. The squadron climbed in staggered pairs, the sun still low behind the Owen Stanley Range. At 12,000 feet, the cloud layer opened into a blue corridor stretching to the north coast. Then the radio crackled with a clipped warning. Bandits. 3 o'clock high. Multiple. There was no time to think. Zeros dropped from above like silver arrows, their engines screaming as they rolled into attack dives. The sky erupted. The pilot yanked the stick left, narrowly avoiding a burst of 7.7 millimeters fire that slashed past his canopy. Instinct took over. He climbed sharply, rolled over the top, and came down behind the trailing Zero, lining up just as it began another climb. He felt the familiar tremor of adrenaline, but this time, he was ready for the moment he had built toward. He steadied the nose, close to exactly 200 yards, and watched that perfect silhouette drift into his gun-sight circle. Trigger, 6 guns, 1 point of impact. The cone of fire tore into the Zero's engine and cockpit in a single violent instant. The aircraft snapped downward in a flaming spiral dot, no hesitation. He slid right, leveling with a second Zero attempting to break away. Again, he held fire, waiting, controlling, disciplining every nerve in his body until the range collapsed too. That magic line, dot, another squeeze of the trigger. Another explosion, dot, the third Zero dove low. Attempting an escape the Warhawk wasn't supposed to match, but the pilot dove with him, tucking in tight, pushing the P-40 harder than recommended. At first it seemed the Zero would slip away until the enemy pilot made a fatal mistake. A shallow climb to reposition. The Warhawk caught him. The distance closed. 2 seconds of tracking. 1 burst. The Zero disintegrated in midair. Silence filled his headset. No cheers. No commentary. Just disbelief. He had done the unthinkable 3 kills in under 2 minutes. Each at the exact convergence range he had chosen. Each kill clean, fast, overwhelming, dot, as he rejoined formation. Even through their oxygen masks, he could sense the shift in the air. The tone had changed. Doubt had evaporated. Something bordering on respect, maybe even off-filled the space between the pilots. The test was over, and the modification had passed. The minutes after the triple kill were surreal. The remaining Zeros scattered, breaking formation, their disciplined tactics undone by what seemed like impossible accuracy. From below, jungle canopy and ocean inlets glinted in the morning sun, but the pilot barely noticed. His focus remained on maintaining formation, conserving fuel, and monitoring the squadron's spacing as they hunted for any remaining enemy aircraft. Back at the front, other pilots were stunned. A lieutenant radioed in, voice tight with disbelief. Did you just take out 3 in less than 2 minutes? No answer came, only the muted roar of engines. The Warhawk rolled into a climb, banking to align with the rest of the squadron. Still, whispers of astonishment circulated among the wingmen. The man they had joked about, called reckless and crazy, had not just survived, he had rewritten their understanding of what was possible in combat. Japanese pilots, unaware of the technical changes made to the American fighter, were bewildered. Reports later noted that formations encountering heavily modified P-40s recorded unusually dense bursts that destroyed aircraft before evasive maneuvers could be completed. It was the psychological impact of concentrated American firepower, terrifying, instantaneous, and disorienting. Enemy pilots found themselves reacting to precision they had previously assumed unattainable, a reaction that confirmed the value of the modifications long before they were fully documented. The pilot squadron continued the patrol for another 20 minutes, sweeping the airspace and driving off scattered enemy aircraft. Each engagement was met with tighter American coordination, as the modified Warhawk's capabilities encouraged the others to close in, trust in concentrated fire, and exploit opportunities with greater confidence. When the flight returned to base, the atmosphere was charged but subdued. Mechanics, armorers, and fellow pilots gathered around the aircraft, eyes wide. Ground crews had monitored test bursts before, but the real-world proof left no room for argument. Witnesses described the concentration of impacts, the visible pattern of destruction, and the near-instant kills. Commanders took note as well. The mission debrief confirmed 3 kills within a remarkably short time, fully aligned with documented combat reports. Maps, gunnery logs, and post-action notes highlighted not just the individual success, but the broader tactical implication. Properly harmonized guns could convert the Warhawk from a sturdy but scattered platform into a precision-killing instrument. The impact rippled through the squadron. Pilots who had been skeptical, dismissive, or quietly critical now sought guidance. Armorers began assisting with recalibration, and informal discussions spread about adopting similar adjustments across other aircraft. The crazy modification was no longer a gamble, it had become a proven method, a tactical edge that would be replicated across multiple flights. The Japanese would soon face this reality repeatedly. Combat reports from later missions documented an increasing pattern. U.S. fighters now struck faster, more decisively, and with a concentration of firepower that left the enemy constantly reacting. The tactical balance shifted incrementally, not through large-scale changes or new aircraft, but through small innovations like this one refined, tested, and executed under fire by resourceful pilots. By the time the squadron landed, the Warhawk bore minor battle scar scratches from tracer fire, small dents from near misses, but it also carried a new status. It was no longer just a fighter. It was a testament to ingenuity, courage, and precise technical knowledge. The pilot, once doubted, now symbolized the capacity of American airmen to adapt, innovate, and dominate despite initial skepticism or ridicule. In the sky over New Guinea, that morning marked more than a successful sortie. It demonstrated the lethal combination of human skill, technical understanding, and bold initiative, proving how a single, carefully calculated modification could decisively change the outcome of combat and how American pilots could leverage ingenuity against an enemy that believed they were already unbeatable. The story of that mission would spread quietly through the ranks. For the Japanese, it became another example of the Americans' relentless adaptability, their deadly precision, and the shock of facing technology modified, refined, and applied with tactical intelligence. And for the 5th Air Force, it became a blueprint for improving performance across all squadrons, creating a subtle but crucial shift in aerial superiority in the Pacific theater. The landing at Port Moresby brought a mixture of relief and quiet celebration. Engines sputtered as ground crews rushed to secure aircraft, while pilots climbed down from their cockpits, faces still flushed from adrenaline. No medals were awarded that day. No press releases awaited them. Yet among the squadron, there was a palpable sense of accomplishment, the kind earned by ingenuity, nerve, and precision under pressure. After-action reports documented the engagement in meticulous detail. The pilots' gunnery logs confirmed the destruction of 3 enemy fighters in under 2 minutes, all within a remarkably tight firing pattern. Tracer impacts and aircraft wreckage validated the tactical hypothesis. Tighter convergence drastically increased lethality in close-range dogfights. The event quickly became a case study within the 5th Air Force. Squadron leaders and operations officers analyzed photographs from gun cameras, measured the dispersion patterns, and noted the exact timing of each kill. They recognized that this small, improvised change had disproportionately large effects. Official memos described it as an example of frontline innovation yielding immediate tactical benefit, a rare acknowledgement of individual adaptation in the formal military. Record, pilots themselves adjusted their attitudes. Previously skeptical squadron members began experimenting with their own modifications, consulting armorers and a pilot who had demonstrated the technique. These changes were still carefully monitored, but the psychological impact was significant. American airmen were emboldened, gaining confidence in their ability to challenge even the most agile Japanese fighters on equal or superior terms. Enemy reactions, as documented in later intelligence assessments, underscored the effectiveness of this adaptation. Japanese pilots reported encounters with U.S. fighters that seemed to deliver unusually concentrated fire, often causing confusion, rapid formation breakups, and forced retreats. Some written assessments noted that American tactics had become unexpectedly aggressive, emphasizing the lethal precision of coordinated bursts. While they could not trace these developments to a single modification, it marked a noticeable trend in American aerial combat superiority. The mission also influenced ground-level operations. Mechanics began sharing techniques for quick, standardized adjustments across squadrons. Field manuals were updated to include recommended convergence patterns for different combat scenarios. The cumulative effect, a new standard of preparedness, born from one pilot's initiative and a willingness to challenge assumptions. But beyond tactics and reports, the aftermath carried human significance. Pilots who had laughed at the crazy modification now respected the intelligence and courage required to implement it under the pressures of constant enemy engagement. The lesson was clear. Survival and success often depended on creative problem-solving as much as raw skill or firepower. It was a quiet but decisive shift in culture, one that would ripple through the Pacific theater in small, incremental ways, building the foundation for greater operational dominance. In the weeks following the mission, the effects of the modification became evident across the 5th Air Force. Other pilots, inspired by the demonstrable success, began experimenting with gun harmonization, adjusting convergence to match anticipated combat ranges. Armorers developed standardized field procedures to replicate the setup efficiently, reducing the risk of misalignment and further increasing squadron-wide lethality. By late 1943, tighter convergence patterns were commonly implemented on P-40s and P-47s operating in the Southwest Pacific. The Japanese, meanwhile, faced a new and unsettling reality. Reports from pilots and intelligence officers indicated that American fighter fire had become exceptionally precise, creating a growing perception of invincibility. Zeros that might have previously escaped unscathed were now destroyed in moments. Formation integrity suffered as pilots became more cautious, defensive maneuvers lengthened, and aggressiveness waned. Some reports described U.S. pilots as striking like a hammer with unerring accuracy, emphasizing the shock induced by concentrated bursts they had not anticipated. The tactical shift also had operational consequences. With improved air-to-air lethality, American commanders gained greater confidence in conducting offensive sweeps over contested areas. Fewer aircraft were lost to attrition, and squadron morale improved significantly. Pilots were no longer merely relying on superior aircraft or individual skill. They had a repeatable method to maximize effectiveness, giving the 5th Air Force a measurable advantage in engagements with Japanese air forces. Casualty statistics reflected this trend. While air combat remained dangerous, reports from July to September 1943 showed a notable increase in U.S. kill ratios against Japanese fighters in regions where modified convergence was widely adopted. This small technical adjustment translated directly into operational success. Fewer American pilots lost, fewer aircraft damaged, and greater control of the airspace over key strategic points like Buna, Wa, at Port Moresby. The psychological effect within the squadron was equally profound. Pilots who had once mocked the modification now deferred to the pilot who had pioneered it, not out of fear, but from respect. He became a quiet leader, a source of guidance on technical adjustments and tactical maneuvers. Younger or less experienced pilots began adopting his methods, ensuring that the lessons learned were passed on organically rather than imposed from above. In a small but crucial way, the modification had reshaped not only combat effectiveness, but also the culture of the unit. Finally, the mission underscored a broader principle of war, innovation at the individual level. could have strategic impact. The Japanese were forced to react to American ingenuity, adjusting tactics, formation spacing, and engagement strategies to counter a threat that had evolved in real time. Meanwhile, American pilots learned that intelligence, courage, and technical skill could tip the balance in their favor, even against a highly skilled and experienced opponent. The events over New Guinea in July 1943 demonstrated that success in war was never purely a matter of numbers or machines. Sometimes, it was the precise alignment of human ingenuity, tactical understanding, and technical mastery that determined the outcome of life and death encounters in the skies. And from this, the stage was set for the final reflection, a calm, measured look at what this small but decisive action meant for the war, for aviation, and for human innovation in combat. The events of that July morning in New Guinea illustrate a timeless truth of warfare. Victory often emerges from the smallest acts of ingenuity executed under immense pressure. A single pilot, quietly adjusting the convergence of his guns, transformed a standard Warhawk into a precision instrument of destruction. What seemed crazy to some became decisive in minutes. Proof that innovation is inseparable from courage and skill. In the skies over New Guinea, American airmen faced an enemy with superior maneuverability and experience. Yet it was not raw talent alone that allowed them to prevail. It was resourcefulness, adaptability, and a willingness to challenge assumptions. This modification, born of observation, calculation, and daring, underscores the human dimension of warfare, that even in machines of steel and fire, the mind of a pilot can tip the balance. The story also highlights the psychological edge of innovation. Japanese pilots, accustomed to early dominance, were stunned by the concentrated American fire. Their reactions: panic, disarray, retreat, demonstrate how perception and expectation shape outcomes as much as bullets or engines. On the American side, confidence was reinforced. Trust in skill and ingenuity spread through the squadron, building cohesion and inspiring further technical refinements beyond tactical success. The episode speaks to a broader legacy. Frontline innovation became institutionalized, influencing how the U.S. Air Force approached aerial combat throughout the Pacific Campaign. Techniques pioneered by one bold individual informed training, standard operating procedures, and the culture of adaptability that defined American air operations. Finally, it is a reminder of the human spirit in extreme circumstances. Amid mud, heat, danger, and constant threat, men found ways to solve problems, push boundaries, and achieve mastery over chaos. That summer day, 3 zeros fell in minutes, but the lasting victory was far larger: the affirmation that intelligence, courage, and meticulous preparation can magnify the power of technology, turning ordinary machines and ordinary pilots into instruments of extraordinary effect. And as the sun rose over the Owen Stanley Range, the Warhawk, its pilot, and the lessons learned soared beyond the immediate battle, leaving a legacy of precision, ingenuity, and the enduring American will to prevail.